Anyone who's ever worked a night shift job will tell you that it eventually gets old. I remember being really excited about starting my first night shift job. I thought it would be so cool, like that episode of SpongeBob with the hash-slinging slasher or something. It was nothing like that at all. In fact, it got plain old repetitive after a while. I'm a male nurse and I had been working in a hospital nearby. It was a long commute and extremely unbearable. Once I finished my contract with the hospital, which was a year, I decided to apply for another job. One that was a little less stressful and disorganized as the hospital. I got a job at a child psychiatric unit. Working with children with mental illnesses seemed like a really cool job. Maybe cool isn't even the right word, but meaningful. The hospital left me with this feeling of trying to save people who were going to die anyway. But with these kids, I could make a real difference that might turn their life around, or find a way to let them cope with whatever is wrong with them. I was all around excited about it. The pay was even higher, which had me really excited too. The only problem was that the only shift available was night shift. The hiring manager told me that there might be a day shift position available within a couple of months, and I would be the first one to get it if it opened up, but that was about it. So there I was helping kids, at night. The only problem was that they were all asleep for the most part. The only time I got to do anything was when one of them woke up or started misbehaving. This very quickly became the most boring job I've ever worked in my life. About a month went by when something moderately frightening happened. It was a night like any other. I was sitting at my desk charting some stuff I'd done with the kids earlier that night. I heard a noise that I did not quite recognize at first. It sounded like some of the kids were wrestling or something, but on the bed. I got really anxious as I did not want to go in there and see the mentally handicapped kids having sex. Call me cynical, but that's where my mind went immediately. But when I got in there, I saw something that I don't think I can ever unsee. I turned the light on to see one of the older kids who was trying to smother another one. The kid that was doing the smothering had no previous incident of violent behavior. I didn't personally know these kids well enough because I didn't work during the day, but I knew their cases well enough that the kid doing the smothering had bipolar disorder. It was pretty severe, but he had never had a violent outburst like this. It was just so unusual. I immediately pulled him off the other kid, and then he started fighting me. He reached around his own head and punched me in the nose at a weird angle. This kid had to have been 11 or 12 years old, and I was honestly surprised at how much force he had behind his punch. He didn't break my nose or anything, but he definitely bloodied it up. My adrenaline kicked in after that, and I was able to restrain him without a problem. I called for a nurse from another unit in the building to come over and help me. It felt like it was forever waiting for this other nurse, but she got over within a few minutes. The entire time I was waiting, though, I couldn't help but to look at this little kid who had nearly murdered another kid. When the other nurse got over, we gave him some medication that would knock him out and put him to sleep. I asked the other nurse, Carla, what I was supposed to do. She was there for a few years before me, and I assumed she would have a good answer. We just did everything you can do. Violent outbursts don't get kids thrown out of here. I was a little shocked. I argued with her a little, but that was that. I tried talking to the kid that was being smothered, and he didn't have a whole lot to say about it. He said that he didn't really know the other kid that well, but they never had a negative incident up until this night. This was a few years back now, and I cannot ever forget how I almost watched that kid die. If I had been just a few minutes later, he probably would be dead right now. It wasn't long after that experience that I started looking for another job. I got one a few weeks later and did my best to explain the situation to my case manager. She didn't seem to understand or care, but that's not my problem anymore. I worked the night shift at a crappy motel a couple of years ago. I remember having a job at a friend's business, and this place paid a few dollars more. As much as I liked my friend, more money was more money. And that was that. They weren't offended or anything, so it was all good. The first night working at this motel was really interesting. Being trained was pretty painful, as I'm sure any worker knows. The really difficult part of the job didn't come in till about 2 months into it. That was when I was comfortable enough behind the desk that I could do everything 100% on my own, and I got better at reading the different kinds of guests. What I mean by that is I've developed some kind of sense for if they were a good or bad person. Right away, I could tell you if someone was getting a motel room for a business trip or if they were doing it to meet a hooker. People just had certain tendencies, and with enough exposure to them, you can begin to spot the patterns. There was this one night when a man who seemed very sketchy came up to the counter. He looked very dirty. He also looks like he was on a drug of some kind, though I'm not sure I could tell you which one. I very rarely saw anyone high or drunk, so it was just a little unusual. He stayed for a couple of nights, and he had some kind of problem with his room just about every shift of mine. It seemed a little weird, but I guess it is what it is. Every time I saw this guy, I got more curious about what exactly he was doing here. From what I gathered, he was booking a motel for a week and staying up all night. I assumed that he was sleeping during the day, but I can't really say with any certainty. I also noticed that he occasionally left the motel probably at about 5 o'clock in the morning. How do you speculate about what he could have been doing, but there wasn't anything I could really do about it. I didn't want to ask him because, well, would you? So I just tried to calm down my own curiosity for a short period of time. That was when he came out of his motel room one night. He did his usual rounds of coming down and asking for more soap. I can't imagine why he used so much, especially because he still seemed pretty dirty to me. Either way, I obliged his request. He sat down in the main lobby for a couple of minutes, though. There were these waiting chairs that were always empty, and he sat down, and one of them, he laid his phone down next to the table that was by his side. He got up and ordered something from the vending machine. He started just sitting there and eating for a few minutes. It was a little awkward, not gonna lie. For some reason, he randomly said, "Oh shit," and walked out of the room. I noticed that he left his phone on the table. He had completely forgotten. It was a flip phone, so there wasn't going to be any passcode or anything I had to crack. After a minute or two of him being gone, I let my curiosity get the better of me. I started snooping. I saw one phone number saved, and it was to a contact named Darlene. They had an area code I didn't recognize, and no, I'm sorry, but I don't remember what it was. I just know it wasn't from our surrounding area. They had the weirdest text message conversation I had ever read in my life. It was extremely vague, but also kind of ominous. My mind instantly jumped to the idea that they were murderers or something. Bear in mind, I was reading these in a panicked state of mind, so I probably did not read them as thoroughly as I should have. The text messages did not have any time or date stamps, so they could have happened at any time for all I knew. I noticed something weird about the text messages, though. He had texted her more times than she texted him. Whoever this Darlene person was, started ignoring this guy. The last text message that I had read was the most recent one, where he texted her asking where she was and if she was going to be showing up tonight. I think I only had about 2 minutes of looking at his phone before he started coming back. Thankfully, the chairs were around the corner from where he could have seen me. I was able to put his phone back down exactly where it had been, and then I went back to the front desk. He came back out and went over to grab his phone. I was assuming that he had forgotten it, remembered, and came back. He stood there looking at it for a good minute. I tried not to look at him and be too oblivious about it, but I was pretty sure that he could sense that something was off. He felt my anxiety, or at least I thought he did. He stood there with his back to me for a few more seconds, but then he did something that I didn't expect. He turned around really quickly, really darted, and did it in a fast movement. He looked right at me and then started walking up to the front desk to speak to me. Keep in mind, this must have been at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and there was absolutely no one around. He started asking me how much money I made working at the motel. I told him how much I make in an hour. Even started asking me if I wanted to make more tonight. I didn't quite understand what he was getting at. He was a much older man, at least 50 years old. The last thing I was going to assume was that he wanted to have sex with me. After all, I was only 19 years old. He pulled out a $200 bill and put it on the front desk, and he told me that he would make it quick if I came up to his room. My mind made the connection, and I instantly felt really grossed out. He must have seen the expression on my face change, and I told him that I wasn't interested. This is the point in the story when I started to feel really freaked out. I didn't know what to do. He did not like the fact that I told him no and offered $100 more for an hour. When I said no again, he grabbed me by the arm. It honestly shocked me a little bit. My entire body would have jerked away if he hadn't been holding me so tight. He then began threatening me and saying that he can do whatever he wants with me for free if he kills me after. The panic sunk in, and I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed for security, and surprisingly enough, he totally booked it. He went right back to his room, and a few minutes later I saw him leave the motel. He never has to know that the motel I was working at didn't have any security or cameras or anything else. If he had attacked me and done something horrible to me that night, there really would not have been anything to stop him. I'm really lucky that I was able to think on my feet because that may have saved my life. I worked at a museum a couple of years back, maybe a decade ago now. I was a night shift security guard. It was as boring as you could imagine. But I desperately needed the money and it paid a few dollars more than any other job I could land, so I figured why not. I remember landing a construction job a year into working this night shift security job. I enjoyed construction a lot more and I desperately needed to get my life back on track. Being on night shift really messed with my mood and general well-being. The construction job I got had roughly the same pay, so it was a no-brainer even if I had to do a little bit more manual labor. As much as I disliked the job itself, I really liked all of the people that worked at that museum. They were actually really cool. I went ahead and gave them my 2 weeks' notice and told them that I would stick around for as long as they needed me to find a replacement. They hired some skinny pale guy named Justin. When I first met him, he seemed like he was a decent enough guy. After all, it really wasn't my problem once I left. After a couple of shifts with him, though, I noticed that he was an extremely awkward and very strange person. He did this thing where he would change the tone of his voice mid-sentence. It was really strange, and it almost made me feel like he had some kind of mental issue. Trust me, I wasn't being judgmental or anything, and if you heard it yourself, you would probably have had the same concern. Not that I thought that he was dangerous or anything, just a little out there with a possible mental illness. Maybe even a speech impediment. Anyway, it was my 3rd or 4th shift training him, and it was an ordinary night just like any other. As weird as he may have been, he seemed somewhat depressed or sad. I caught on pretty easily as he did not make much of an effort to conceal it. We were making the usual trip throughout the entire museum, which was honestly a pretty long walk. We were probably about 10 minutes into it when I finally just asked him why he seemed so sad. He told me that he was really lonely and couldn't get a girlfriend. Again, if you had one look at this guy, you would understand why he couldn't get a girlfriend, let alone his very weird personality. I tried telling him that there were plenty of fish in the sea and that he could probably have some luck on the internet. Online dating wasn't his big back. Then, he kind of shrugged his shoulders and just continued being sad. I didn't know what else I could tell him. After that point, he gradually became weirder and weirder with each passing night. It was really strange. For instance, he would start going on these massive monologues about the most random things in the world. I only had to stay for a couple more shifts, but it honestly became really intolerable being around this guy. There was one night where he talked for at least 15 entire minutes about the environmental harm of pizza crust. Yes, literally pizza crust. It made absolutely no sense in the world. I tried interrupting him a couple of times to ask what was up, but he just cut me off and even started ignoring me after a certain point. When you are completely alone in a massive building with one other person, oh, trust me, when I say that their mental well-being is very important. I gradually began feeling more and more unsafe in the presence of this weird guy. Justin seemed like he was going crazy or something. Thankfully, my last shift with him went by decently enough. It was still awkward and moderately unbearable, but it was at least over. I started my new job and everything seemed to be going really well. I had completely forgotten about Justin and life seemed to move on. I didn't really think about that security job anymore at all. That was until I heard about an interesting story from my friend a few months later. I still kept in touch with a few people from the museum that worked there during the day. We were only Facebook friends, but that was enough for me. One of them messaged me to ask me what I thought about the guy that replaced me, Justin. I was honest with her and told her that I thought Justin was a really strange guy and possibly insane or something. She typed back, "You're going to love this story then." She then proceeded to tell me about Justin being fired for completely destroying an entire exhibit on night shift. I guess they came in at the morning shift and found him trying to put it back together. They watched the security footage and this guy literally tried fighting a dinosaur skeleton. I guess he had been acting really weird that night, judging by what she told me about the rest of the security footage. But the interesting part of the story is that they somehow found out he was on antipsychotic medication. They figured that he had stopped taking his medication. That was all my friend knew, and that's all I know. It's really scary how people can just stop taking their very necessary medication on a whim and then have a complete mental breakdown. I started wondering if he had been off his meds when I met him. All I know is that I'm kind of happy I don't ever have to see Justin again.